heritage consultant and with specialties in cultural heritage and social history. To me, though, and Margaret, you will undoubtedly tell me if I'm wrong, to me, Margaret is an environmental historian. I say that because, to me, environmental history is a field that is actually extremely important. It is a field that enables us to examine the relationships between people and environment and change in both spheres. It enables us to understand how we've arrived where we are now. And perhaps most importantly, and this is the case in Margaret's book, I urge you to buy it. It's got a fabulous title, A River with a City Problem. It is a really good read. I'm getting no royalties from this. So. That book and many others enable us to examine policy history. How were policies developed? When did they go wrong? Why did they go wrong? When did they work, if they ever worked? And I think this applies to all fields of environmental and natural resource management. In fact, many other fields as well, particularly to the areas that I think probably interest this audience. So, to me, it's an extremely important field. This book, I think, is a very valuable contribution to demonstrating the perfidy, stupidity, and hubris of people who made policy decisions about floods in Brisbane. And I could apply the same set of words to Cairns. I'm going to end by a small personal plug. Some years ago, I contributed a chapter to this book when I was at the Australian National University. It's called Environmental History and Policy. It's quite old now. Still buy it. Or get it at the library. That's, to me, the key issue that I'm hoping Margaret will speak about. So without further ado, over to you, Margaret.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen? Can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
Oh, good. You can see the screen too? You had me worried before. Can you see a photo of Brisbane on your screen?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And to clarify, I have been those things. I do currently call myself an environmental historian. And the reason I like environmental history is for exactly the reasons that you just explained, in that it allows me to ask a lot of difficult questions to explain the present. And I think that's what history at its best can try and do. It's not seeking the truth. I won't go that far. But it does go a long way to try and explain how we've got where we've got now. And I want to look at how we've looked at floods in Brisbane and also give you some ideas about what we could do. So I'm actually speaking to you from Ipswich, and I am sorry I did not make it to Cairns. It's in the lands of the Yagara people, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And this slide you can see here shows the winding Brisbane River. And in the Yagara and Terrible Dreaming story, they talk about, they call the river Maiwa, and they talk about the rainbow serpent called Murugara. And Murugara one day gets stuck on the sand because she's so large and it hasn't rained for a long time. So she gets stuck in the sand. So she sings for rain. And the rain arrives, and as the rain seeps under her belly, she's able to move from side to side across the landscape. And as she slithers the way that snakes do, she creates this sinuous river that you can see here. And it's quite a feature of Brisbane. It divides the city into north and south. And as you can see from this image, and you'll see when I talk about the history, a lot of Brisbane is bound by this river. So it does make it quite vulnerable to flooding. In fact, Brisbane has the dubious claim of being the most flood-prone catchment in Australia, not one you'd particularly want. And it's also a problem that's escalating because it's one of the fastest growing areas in Australia, and riverside land is very, very appealing, particularly for expensive real estate. Part of the problem in Brisbane, as is the problem in most places, is legacy issues. we chose to build on a floodplain. And when I say we, I mean the British settlers from colonisation. So you've got this legacy issue. And whilst this is a story that I'm telling tonight is about Brisbane, it does apply to a lot of cities on rivers, and in particular, any subtropical or tropical cities. So today what I want to do is pose the question, what can we learn from history that will help us deal with floods? And I first want to get your bearings right, so you've got an idea of the land that we're talking about. And here's the Brisbane catchment. So a lot of the rain falls in the headwaters up near Crowhamhurst that you can see there, the Upper Brisbane River and the Stanley River. And there's a dam at Somerset and there's another dam built. And all of that water is in the catchment long before it gets to Brisbane. And it's fed by 4 rivers and 22 creeks. So it's a very, very complicated river system as well. Aboriginal stories tell floods in deep time, and explorers, when they came in the 1820s, noticed evidence of flood. In 1824, which wasn't long after a flood had actually occurred, government botanist and explorer Alan Cunningham noted flood debris really high in the trees, and he also noted deep scouring of banks, which the only way they could have been created is from very, very large floods. But despite the fact that Aboriginal people told them about earlier floods and the explorers saw evidence, the British settlers decided that they would build right on the edge of the river. And so they built a penal colony in Brisbane in 1824. The year before Brisbane became a free settlement, which was in 1842, Brisbane experienced another really, really large flood. We don't really know how big this flood was because there were so few records, but it's probably nearly 8.5 metres, 8.4. So despite the fact that we'd had this massive flood and we had all those earlier warnings, Brisbane decided that it would build on the floodplain. So in 1844, surveyor Henry Wade surveyed the city right to the water's edge, as if flooding wasn't ever going to be a problem. In the early Brisbane plans, it actually talked about having a boulevard along the city, along the river. And I'm enough of a romantic that I can see a boulevard lined with Moreton Bay figs, and I think it would have been fantastic architecturally, aesthetically, but even more importantly, it would have been a wonderful flood buffer between the river and the city. But Governor Gipps decided that Brisbane would never be more than a village. And so that was an incredible waste of land in their way of thinking, so they just built the edge. And from that moment on, Brisbane's flood problem was created. So if we go to the next slide, you can see, in this slide, you can see how Brisbane built right to the edge. So this is in 1888 when the city's really having its boom, and it's really hugging the river. At this time, by about 1890, there were only 100,000 people in the city. But still, you can see that they aren't in the areas away from the river. They're really up against the water. There were early floods in the 1880s, and there was a really large flood in 1890, which reached a peak of 5.3 metres. But that was only really a dress rehearsal for what was about to come. In 1892 and 93, the summer was really, really hot. And it was hot throughout most of Queensland. It had been a really big drought for years, and finally the drought broke, as it often does, with torrential rain. In February in 1893, Brisbane got 1,000 millimetres of rain. And so you get this situation where you have one rainfall that looks like this, and most of that rain fell in the upper catchment. There was a little flood a week later, and then 2 weeks later they got this flood, which was throughout the entire catchment. And basically anything that hadn't flooded in the first flood flooded in this one. These are really large floods. You can see in this slide here a comparison of those floods. They are still amongst the largest floods we've had on record in the record keeping of the British. What happened then is 35 people drowned. They died. 860 acres in South Brisbane and 317 acres in North Brisbane were submerged. And water reached almost 2/3 of the Brisbane business district. And it was so high that it actually lapped the tops of buildings. The main bridge in Brisbane that connected the north and south just washed away, and it took 3 years to rebuild that. In the city, you can see that the streets just became canals. What I was told early on in my research is they always take photos when the water's going down. So this actually would have not been the river at its peak, but these are the main streets of Brisbane in 1893. And the suburbs were just as bad. So this is South Brisbane, and 198 buildings in South Brisbane were completely destroyed and 67 were damaged. On the Eagle Farm Flats, which is out near the airport, 500 houses just washed away. And if you think about these numbers and you've got a city of only 100,000 people, that's an awful lot of the people affected and a lot of the buildings destroyed. The damage bill was between about £1 and £2 million. And the problem was compounded by the fact that we were already in an economic depression in the 1890s. So the economy really didn't recover from this for a really long time. So what they did is they resorted to the age-old solutions that the British had done, which was look to engineering. And they looked for a technical solution to tame the river. And so they had numbers of years where they thought about it and investigated all sorts of reports, but it really wasn't until the 1930s when they had another economic depression and they needed to employ people that they decided to build a dam. And they built Somerset Dam, which was a dual-purpose dam, the first such thing in the Southern Hemisphere, which meant that it could do flood mitigation and also water supply. So now people thought that the floods would be solved. The dam started in 1935, it was delayed by World War II, but then they had Somerset Dam. And you can see Somerset Dam here in 1949. And it can hold back small floods, but most people in Brisbane were deluded into thinking it could hold back all floods. And they thought that nature had been tamed by the dam and there wouldn't be any more floods. The Coordinator General at the time actually warned against building on the floodplain. And he said that a powerful myth was developing that Somerset Dam would prevent floods, and he called it the Somerset Syndrome. Now, what you need to know is that all dams have a finite capacity. If you think about a bath, if you keep pulling the tap, pouring tap water into it, eventually the bath will overflow. Dams are exactly the same. They can capture the water if the water falls upstream of the dam, but if it falls downstream of the dam, there's nothing the dam can do. But because people thought we'd now be safe, lots of people built on the floodplain and businesses and residents moved there. The 1920s was a boom period, but it was even bigger after World War II when we had a massive building boom, partly because of the baby boomers after the war needed lots of accommodation. But also they had expanded public transport. So people were able to actually move even further out onto the floodplain because then they had cars. So people really could move any way they wanted to. Brisbane also had the problem that it didn't have any town plan until 1965, and that's one of those policy issues that's a really big problem. And when it was eventually written, it really didn't even mention floods. It talked about drainage and creek flooding, but it didn't talk about river flooding because that was seen as a state responsibility, and town plans are about local things like creeks. So that was an opportunity that I think we could have done a lot to think about flood mitigation and flood control and where we built our houses, but we didn't. Instead, they just decided to keep relying on the dam. Now, this was actually in defiance of modern practice that was already happening around the world. People were already using land use planning to control where we built, but not in Southeast Queensland because building is really important, apparently. And so we continue to rely on engineering. And so you get this urban development pattern. So you can see the red areas, which is where the areas of development are really intense. And you can see the white sinuous river, and then the train lines that are letting people move into different areas. They're the little black lines. And as I said, with cars, you could move in further out from these railway lines. So you could move into areas that were flood prone that people hadn't built in before. So they developed a whole lot of areas out towards, you can see on this map here, Intrapilli, Graceville and so on, that hadn't been settled before. That's where the university is in St Lucia. that area all floods, and it was only built in the 1960s when we really did know about our flood risk. On Anzac Day weekend in 1974, heavy rain fell throughout the entire Brisbane River catchment. And you can see here that it's in the upper part, but particularly around Brisbane, and it fell into all of our creeks. In 26 days in January, Brisbane received 872 millimetres, which was second only to the 1893 record of 1,000 millimetres. Now, Somerset Dam could hold the Stanley River water, which is the stuff that's in the north, up towards the end. But it couldn't do anything about all that water that fell downstream. And so Somerset Dam was actually only able to reduce the flood height by 1 metre in central Brisbane. And that's what it looked like when it rained. All of those new areas around Kenmore, Graceville, Corinda, St Lucia flooded. So this flood was 5.45 metres at the city gauge, and 14 people died. And approximately 13,000 homes in 17 suburbs were affected by the flood. They were submerged, inundated, or damaged. And here again, you can see the comparative flood heights. Really, 1974 is quite small comparatively. Add a metre there for Somerset Dam and you're getting an idea of the size. So what did they do? Well, this is what the flood damage looked like. Again, it's the same places that's flooded in 1893. This is the new bridge that they built after the 1893 floods. This is the same inner city areas that flooded a second time. There's always a winner in floods, and these are these guys here who managed to steal some beer from that brewery. But the solution they decided was to build another dam. They'd build a bigger dam, and this time it was called Wivenhoe Dam, and it was a second dual-purpose dam. It was flood mitigation and water supply. Now, it had already started in the 1970s, but they decided to fast-track it in 1974, and it's 3 times the size of Somerset. So then the Wivenhoe Dam myth grew, and it spread, and they really decided that with a dam 3 times bigger, Brisbane would be fine. But it continues that dependence on dams, and that's going to be the same solution again, and it allowed us not to think about flood planning control measures. So it wasn't until the late 1970s that they started to look at things like development controls. And what they did is they had a 1 in 100 measure. Now, that's often cited as being 1 in 100 years, but it's not. It's 1 in 100. It's a 1% chance that there will be a flood of that height, a massive flood, in any given year. So 1% chance in any given year. And it doesn't mean that there'll be a balance of 99 years between them. In 1893, there'd been 2 in 1 fortnight. So there goes that myth. And this was terminology that was used in America and imported here. But when it moved from the technical space, it got confused and people started thinking they could wait for 100 years between these massive floods. But as we know, that's not how it works. But the development codes they decided, they worked in the factor that Wivenhoe Dam would save 3 metres from the floods. So they let people build in that flood buffer if it was in that area. Now, I argue in my book that this is really a crazy idea, because when you look at where Somerset Dam and Wivenhoe Dam are, they're halfway up the river system. So anything downstream, the other half, is not saved by those dams at all. So if the rain falls downstream of the dam, it doesn't make any difference what Wivenhoe does. So let's jump forward to 2010. In 2010, we'd had a long drought. We'd had the millennium drought that some of you might remember from 2001 to 2009. It was the worst drought on record so far. And Brisbane and lots of parts of Queensland were really focused on saving water. We were encouraged to have short showers and things like that. And the focus was totally on that side of the equation, the drought side. But then it rained. In December 2010, it rained a lot, and they actually had to let water out of Wivenhoe Dam. So it filled, and they had to release water twice before Christmas. So when the really heavy rain came in January, the dam was full. So it had very little capacity to absorb extra rain, beyond the flood storage compartment. So the equivalent of the 1974 flood flowed into Ivanhoe Dam. And the water supply compartment was already full, so they couldn't absorb that water. And so the dam flood compartment was full. So they started emptying it because that's what the manual says to do. But the process takes 7 days because if they let it go out really, really fast, it causes more damage downstream. So the plan is that they will release it slowly over 7 days. So they let out as much water as they thought they needed to. But 36 hours later, they got the equivalent of another 1974 flood, and they hadn't had the chance to empty the dam. So what they had to do was let out lots and lots of water. Now, Ivanhoe Dam actually has a safety valve, and if it goes above a certain point, the dam automatically releases all the water, because the ultimate strategy in managing a dam is to make sure the dam doesn't break. Partly because it will cause amazing damage downstream, but also it's Brisbane's water supply. About 90% of Brisbane's water comes from this dam. So if the dam is destroyed, we've got all sorts of problems. And so it was 0.5 metre from the point that it was going to release the water automatically. So they had to speed it up. And they let out a lot more water. And as a result, a lot of people were flooded. There was phenomenal flooding in the Lockyer Valley and 21 people died there. And that's west of Ipswich, and it's a tiny little settlement. And 1 person died in Brisbane. 14,000 houses in 94 suburbs in Brisbane were affected. And the fact that it was spread to 94 suburbs shows the Brisbane growth. So 1,200 houses and over 550 businesses were completely destroyed, and another 2,000 were pretty damaged. So the Brisbane City Council calculated, and I think this is an interesting statistic, that 10% of the properties that were flooded in 2011 had been built after the 1974 flood. So they knew those flood heights when those buildings were approved. Now, what about the 3 metres that Ivanhoe Dam was supposed to save? Well, it actually saved 2, but not 3. And what happened was the dam operators were blamed. They were blamed because they were accused of mismanaging the dam. Now, I've written a lot about this. I don't think they're responsible. I think there was a really, really difficult situation that they faced, and they did the best that they could. But I actually think the bigger issue at stake here is that I think if we're able to blame the dam operators, then our faith in the dam remains. We can believe that dams will still work as long as they're operated properly, and that lets us to keep building on the floodplain. And so we end up with this situation. This is the 2011 flood. It's the whole catchment again. So the dam couldn't do anything about that water downstream. It was a phenomenal flood. Much the same damage again is caused by the 2011 flood. Interestingly, the 2011 flood photos are not as good as the earlier photos. But you can see here the damage is still severe. I put in one of Ipswich where I live because it's always very affected as well. The Bremer River on which Ipswich is built doesn't have a dam at all. And this is what the city looked like. So that's why you start getting that damage, because it's becoming quite densely developed. And so that's what it looked like underwater. And these are the comparative flood heights. So the 2011 flood was smaller, and Ivanhoe Dam did take the 2 metres off, but it's still a large flood. So last year, Brisbane had another flood, as I'm sure you remember, because lots of Queensland got wet. So what happened in that flood? Well, in February 2022, Brisbane experienced extreme rain. It was a La Nina year, and that means it's probably more likely that we'll get a flood. It was also the second La Nina year in a row, so everything was quite wet, which means there's a higher ratio of runoff, which makes it more likely we'll get a flood. In Brisbane, some places received, wait for this, over 1 metre of rain in 5 days. Now, just to put this in perspective, that's the same amount of rain that London gets in about a year. Now, the advantage that they had in 2022 was that when the rain started, Ivanhoe Dam was only at 56% capacity. So it was able to put a lot of the rainwater into the water supply compartment before it had to use the flood compartment. And that made a really big difference because basically 2.2 million megalitres could be held back. Now that's some phenomenal number of Olympic swimming pools. It's an awful lot of water. The dam reached 170%. Now they talk about that because what it means is the 100% of the water supply part and then 70% of the flood compartment. And so at its peak, it was at 187%. But much of the rain fell downstream of the dam. And the intensity was so extreme that the runoff was so big. And so there was more flooding caused by overland flow than the river in 2022. And lots of the creeks flooded that hadn't flooded in 2011. And lots of places on the north side of Brisbane that hadn't flooded in 2011, but did flood in 74, flooded again. And so the areas that got flooded were very, very extensive. The river itself was actually a relatively small flood. You can see here nearly 4 metres, but the problem was the runoff and the creeks and overland flow. And the city looked like this in 2022. This is 2022, sorry. That was the last one was 2011. So there you go. There's the 2022 floods. Again, the city terminals got, the city cat terminals got washed away, and much of the city area got flooded again. So it's the same areas every single time. I want to just have a quick glimpse into the future. I don't think historians are futurists, but I think we need to think about what's the impact of climate change and what's the impact of growth. I said at the start that Brisbane is the most flood impacted catchment in Australia. And without management and with future development and continued population growth, this flood risk is going to increase. There's no doubt about that. But it's going to get worse with climate change, and the weather patterns are already changing. We know that climate change will increase Brisbane's flood hazard, and it's compounding in many different ways. So this is the probability that we'll get these floods. So what's going to happen is that the floods will actually increase in frequency. So what is a 1 in 100 year flood might actually occur more frequently than it has in the past. And you can see here that you're going to start seeing those floods probably more frequently in your own lifetime. If you get a 1 in 10 flood, it will inundate 51 buildings. But if you make it a 1 in 100, we're looking at 12,000 buildings. And if you're looking at a 1 in 500 flood, which can happen, we'll be looking at 32,000 buildings. So the compounding factor is really, really huge. And this slide gives you an idea of those numbers. That's what it looked like when you start getting these bigger floods. They're going to be more and more and more buildings affected. So even if you don't allow for development growth, we're going to be looking at flood damages doubling by 2090. And flood losses at the moment, they worked out from the 2019 figures, were $6.7 million. But we're going to be looking at billions. So this was a flood risk in 2017. So it just gives you a bit of an idea of how many houses are actually on the floodplain. And we know it's bigger already. And without further mitigation or management, these numbers will increase. They're estimating that will increase by 80%. And under the most extreme modelling for climate change, it could be an increase of 360%. So why is climate change even a factor? They talk about how it will make the floods worse, but I thought I'd better actually let you know how. So we're going to get more increased rainfall. We'll start getting a rainfall of 30% higher, and that's in southeast Queensland. So North Queensland's probably going to get more. We're going to be looking at more frequent flash flooding. So we'll get lots of rain more and more intensely. And that creates that runoff that I mentioned for the 2022 floods. With sea level rise, the Brisbane River floods won't be able to get away because Moreton Bay will actually be higher. So that's going to create a backlog in the water in the river, which will make it harder for it to get away. We will have drier soils. Now that's good to a point because it will absorb more water. But it means that, again, we can get more runoff and we can get more erosion. And we will have higher temperatures. So we'll start getting smaller few floods, but we'll get intense floods. And with warmer seas, we'll start seeing cyclones come further down the coast. And often Brisbane's floods are associated with cyclones and the tropical lows that come with them. So what can we do about it? It's all well and good to say it's going to be worse, and it certainly is, but I don't want to leave you with a sense of gloom and doom. So I want to think just briefly, so you've got time for discussion, about some of the things we can do. It is going to get worse because Brisbane's been slated for being one of the most densely populated areas in Australia. The regional plan expects that Brisbane will grow to another 1.8 million people over the next 20 years. It's only 2.8 at the moment. So, that's close to doubling. And the areas that they've set aside for this development is the inner city. 60% of that growth is going to go in the city because that's where the transport is and that's where people want to live. So that means there's going to be more and more people exposed to floods. Unmanaged development will also increase floods because more hard surfaces mean that the floodwaters are trapped and the flow rates and the flood paths are changed. So we really need to think about where we build and how we build, because if we're going to have this urban growth, we really need to think about where it's going to go. Under the worst case scenarios, Brisbane floods could be 2.5 metres higher, but they will be almost certainly a metre higher, depending on which scenario you choose. It's anticipated that weather systems will move more slowly, which means they'll be able to dump a lot more water into the system, as we saw in February 2022. And it was said, the forecast was that it would move offshore, and it just didn't. So we're seeing the effects of climate change already, and it's going to get worse, and this is a global trend. And yet, we continue to build on the floodplain. Even after 2022, we're still building there. Now, I argue that we can't deal with our current flood risk. So how on earth are we going to manage a future with more floods and another 1.8 million people? Now, I'm not advocating the floodplain because that's never going to happen, because the cost is really prohibitive. But we could stop increasing our growth on the floodplain. And as the cost of each flood increases, the economics change. So perhaps we need to seriously think about moving properties that are most at risk. Perhaps, for example, we could implement the flood control levels that are the height of the 1974 flood, rather than assume that Wivenhoe will save 3 metres. If they'd done that with the 1974 flood and used that as the level, 9,000 houses wouldn't have been flooded in 2011. That's an awful lot of families and houses that went underwater, perhaps unnecessarily. We need to break this cycle. We're in a cycle of escalation and more damage. And we need to think about rezoning. We actually have to have some braver councils who will refuse more development applications. And we need state government to step up and approve good planning schemes that reduce the hazard in the floodplain. Town planners are really key in this whole thing, but they have been party to building rather than prevention. After the 2022 floods, they did do some really good things. They introduced a buyback scheme, which will purchase 500 houses for demolition. And that means that no one can build on that land again, and it will be non-inhabitable land for there on in. And that's a really good start. But if I've mentioned 9,000 houses getting flooded, you can see that 500 is not going to make an enormous difference. That's a really good start. I'm really keen on this, and I hope it's such a success that they will find money to continue that program. They also introduced a house raising scheme where houses could be moved above flood height. Now, this works quite well for the Queenslander sort of house that you can see here on the slide, because it's already on stilts, so you can raise it. It's not so good for the slab on ground house that you can see on the right. But the problem is some of these flood heights are phenomenal. You would need in some places to raise houses 3 or 4 metres. They'd need a lift, so that's not going to work. They also introduced a resilient housing scheme, which means we start thinking about different building materials that we can use. Now, this has not been legislated, and it could be. This is a policy change that would be very important. We've actually done it for cyclones, and we've done it a little bit for fires, but we're yet to really mandate it for floods, and it does make an enormous difference. And I'll show you some of the things you can do. Just like you use tie rods for cyclones, you can be really careful about how you attach buildings to the ground, because if you've got enough runoff, even a building or stumps will just walk away. You can design your houses so the living areas are all above flood height. Now, what quite people have done is they've built underneath these houses. That's not how they were intended. So the idea would be that water could flow in underneath. There is a guide for how you can make your houses more resilient, and that's a really good step in the direction that I really want people to start to see. We've got to think about adapting the way we live and the way we build. And so these are some of the things that they're doing. So rather than use chipboard or timbers, they're trying to use hardwood or fibro cement cladding. They're using steel frames rather than timber frames. They're using human-created composite timbers and waterproof rendering. They're starting to use concrete floors or rubber or vinyl floors. And that means you'll be able to clean that area out. It won't stop it flooding, but it'll let you get back in the house a lot faster. Now, they did this after the 2022, before the 2022 floods, and they found that people did get back into their houses a lot quicker. You can see in that image that the power points have been moved up a lot. Now, it might not seem like a lot to move your power point 1.5 meters up the wall. They don't have to be at the ground level, but that means it's going to be a lot easier to fix your electricals after. And so there's no cabinetry there under the sink, so that's not going to get damaged either. This is a kitchen. You can see that all the cabinetry is on little legs. It's on stainless steel frames. All of that can actually come out. So you can remove that furniture if you know the floods are coming. And if the floods appear in the headwaters, Brisbane's got 2 or 3 days to clean out houses. So if you're prepared, you can move things like this. We're looking at acrylic surfaces. We're looking at marine plywood, things that are actually more appropriate for water. And so you can start thinking about how we build our houses that make them a lot more resilient. We can stop having carpets and go back to rugs. Rugs can be rolled up and taken away. So it will reduce the damage and it'll let you get back in your house a lot faster. So what I want to put to you just as my last slide here is I wonder what the future is going to look for this little boy. Will we have made the problem worse? What are floods going to look like in the future? The thing that I want to leave you with is that it's actually colonisers that have occupied the floodplain. It's us who've decided to settle there, and we've caused the problem. By building a city on a river, we've interrupted the river's natural cycle of flood and drought. And in doing so, we have actually created a city problem for the river. Thank you.